The prophets of Ragzir sat within their vaulted temple at the edge of the trinary drift, where stars bled colorless light and time bent to the gravity of secrets. They were 10 in number, wrapped in shrouds of glistening obsidian thread, their mouths sealed not by flesh but by oaths older than the formation of the galactic accord. They had spoken only thrice in the last 1,000 cycles, and now once more their throats opened to prophecy. "Hear the weakness of the humans," intoned the first prophet, voice like slow thunder cracking the silence of space. "They fracture under grief, they die for the unworthy, their spirits burn quick and die quicker still." Each word echoed through the oracle channels, carried into the neural cores of the Varaki Dominion, the Celadon Harmonium, the Krith Wards, and dozens more. These were the voices that charted the future of empires. The humans, new, uncultured, scattered along the Orion arm, had been measured and dismissed. The verdict spread like radiation across the core worlds. Humanity was too volatile, too emotional, too chaotic to ever matter. Their incursions beyond Sol were primitive sparks in a void of cold calculation, a species to be observed, not engaged. Yet while the galaxies moved to more pressing wars, while fleets shifted against each other in ancient grudges and quiet armistices, something flickered beneath the surface of Earth. That year they called it the Sol Reckoning. Captain Issa Rain stood atop the scorched ridge overlooking the no-man's sky, a stretch of dead world carved by plasma artillery, irradiated storms, and the broken bodies of two clashing civilizations. Her face was hidden behind a blackened visor, her breath fogging the interior. The suit's haptics vibrated with incoming telemetry from the forward scouts. Behind her, the 9th Human Expeditionary Brigade was licking its wounds. 8,000 strong at the start of the campaign, barely 2,500 remained. They had been sent to Brackel's Rim, a dust-ravaged moonscape claimed by both the Syndic and the Vatari Covenant. The Accord had deemed it unworthy of notice. But the humans, bold, desperate, stubborn, had chosen to intervene when the civilians trapped between lines began a call for aid. Rain didn't care about the political calculus. She'd seen the children dying from radiation burns, she'd seen the shattered domes, and she knew Earth wouldn't let the screaming go unanswered. Her orders were simple: hold the corridor, evacuate the refugees, break through if necessary. It had been necessary. They pushed through Syndic fortifications in 36 hours, only to be ambushed by a Vatari spearhead. The two enemies had ignored each other to focus on annihilating the humans. What had begun as a humanitarian mission became a fight for survival in terrain no sane strategist would ever choose to defend. Now the air was toxic with metallic dust. The sky glimmered with falling debris and weapons platforms long since gone silent. It was a place no one lived, only died. And still Issa Rain stood. Her second-in-command, Lieutenant Walker, approached from the shadow of a collapsed crawler tank. His armor was pitted and leaking coolant. "Scouts report movement on the far ridge," he said. "Could be Vatari stragglers or worse." "Worse would be better," Rain replied. "At least then we'd be sure we're not already ghosts." She turned and descended into the ravine where the wounded were being triaged. Med drones buzzed low, stitching flesh and administering nanoplastics. The battlefield surgeons had long since run out of proper supplies. They worked now with makeshift kits and the sheer tenacity of experience. Rain nodded at a medic applying burn foam to a groaning corporal's face. No one saluted. They didn't need to. Rank had become something quieter, earned not in symbols but in survival. Orbiting above, aboard the Krith observation vessel Vularian Reach, the alien tactician Mechadon shifted uneasily in his exopod. He was a strategist by birth and caste, bred to read wars like rivers to predict the outcomes of battles before the first shot was fired. He had watched the humans arrive on Brackel's Rim with detached amusement. Their approach had no elegance, their formations were inconsistent, their logistics a nightmare, and yet somehow they had not collapsed. His multiple minds could not explain it. "Begin historical variance analysis," he ordered his internal AI. "Uncertain factors exceed doctrinal margins. Human adaptive capacity remains statistically anomalous." Anomaly, always that word with humans. The Krith did not like anomalies, they liked equations. Meanwhile, back on the surface, something shifted. As the dusk of Brackel's Rim deepened, a Vatari scout stumbled through the haze. He was young, bleeding heavily from a wound across his thorax, the exoshell of his suit shattered. He should not have been alive. Issa saw him first, limping toward the edge of her perimeter, weaponless, his three-fingered hands raised in surrender or confusion. Her soldiers raised their rifles. Every instinct screamed to fire. But she did not. She walked forward instead. Not slowly, not cautiously, purposefully. "Captain," Walker began. "Stand down." Her voice cut like command steel. The alien collapsed, coughing blood, twitching from plasma burns. One eye was gone, the other flickering with terror. Rain bent, knelt, and lifted him onto her shoulder. For a moment no one moved, then the entire camp watched in silence as she carried the enemy through the mud and blood and wreckage, past barricades, past med tents, past the eyes of her own dying men and women. She placed him on a surgical slab, connected oxygen, called for a transfusion tank, and began to work. No speech, no grand gesture, only action. Later, the footage would leak, captured by a surveillance drone scavenged by a young comms officer. It would spread across sectors and species, played and replayed in council halls, war rooms, and shadowy conclaves. Many dismissed it as a lie, others as a calculated stunt, but a few, those who listened deeper, recognized something ancient in the gesture. And on the Vularian Reach, Mechadon watched and whispered something not meant for the minds of his own kind. She carried him. And then louder, they carry their enemies. The room went silent. Far away in the temple of Ragzir, the prophets stirred from their sleep. A ripple moved across the oracle crystals. And for the first time in 1,000 cycles, the prophets revised a line of their prophecy. They struck out a word. Weakness. The Arab of Brackel's rim became quiet not because peace had come, but because the machines of war had run out of fuel, munitions, and orders. The Syndic fleets had withdrawn after overextending themselves against Vatari's strongpoints, and the Covenant had suffered catastrophic losses in their pursuit of the human contingent. For the first time in 87 standard cycles, the No Man's Sky held no screaming missiles, no descending drop pods, only ash and static. The humans remained. Captain Rain had built her forward base into a fortress of necessity. There were no walls, only collapsed crawler chassis welded together, defensive turrets fed by salvaged batteries, and sensors hacked into shape from the remains of alien wrecks. The wounded Vatari whom she had carried lived. His name was recorded as Taranjar, sub-warrior of the Covenant's 5th Ascendancy Spear. He had expected torture, interrogation, perhaps a public broadcast of humiliation. Instead, he found silence, antiseptic pain, and a child's voice asking if his people had schools like humans did. That child was Yumi Reyes, a medic's daughter, and the only civilian left alive from the original refugee convoy. "You look like the statues in my storybook," she told him, "except with more blood." Taran could not reply, his throat wrapped in gel seal and healing mesh, but he listened. Over the course of 6 days, Taran watched the humans repair one another, not with efficiency, he would not call it that, but with a stubbornness that denied logic. Broken arms splinted with carbon tubing, rations shared in equal parts even when officers hadn't eaten, and above all, a command structure that bent like fire-forged alloy, flexible, reactive, unpredictable. He began to understand something few of his kind had considered. The humans had no doctrine, but they had each other. In the central spire of the Celadon Harmonium, high-voice Aetles held an emergency quorum. The footage of Captain Rain had reached them. It was analyzed, authenticated, and still it defied protocol. The Harmonium believed in harmony through pattern, through repetition of perfection. This act, this deviation, was an affront and a puzzle. "She chose compassion over security," said the second voice. "It is statistically indefensible." "It is not compassion," Aetles replied. "It is strategy beyond our calculation." "Explain." "She gambled the trust of her command, the cohesion of her unit, and the moral high ground of her species on a dying enemy soldier. A gamble with no outcome. No, a seed." The Celadon did not speak of seeds lightly. They revered the concept, growth, evolution, transformation. Aetles ordered the dispatch of covert observation drones to Brackel's rim. The humans, once dismissed, were becoming interesting. A week later, the Covenant returned, not with an army but with a signal. Encoded, ancient, laced with religious overtones and hierarchical structure, it broke through the static storms surrounding Brackel's rim. It named no targets, it requested no surrender. It asked for a meeting. Captain Rain stood before the relay screen, her officers tense behind her. Taran, still weak but mobile, stood at her side in armor half-patched with human materials. The message was simple, the one who carried, "Speak with us." Rain agreed. The meeting was held at the convergence point known as Wound Glass Basin, a crater carved by an orbital kinetic strike 3 decades prior. It was sacred ground to the Vatari. Many believed the Covenant had intended to wipe out the humans in that very strike during the early days of the skirmish. Now, the humans stood upon it by right of survival. Rain walked into the basin unarmed. 5 Vatari ascendants waited, their glimmering armor etched with living scripture. The leader, High Ascendant Vakil, bore the spiral mark of judgment, a symbol given only to those permitted to interpret the sacred expansion. You carried our fallen, Vakil said without preamble. Why? Because he was dying, Rain replied, and I had the means to stop it. No tactical value, no reward. You spent resources and risked morale. He was in front of me, that was enough. The Vatari stared in silence, their breath exhaling through polyphonic choral tones, a sign of agitation. You wage war like wildfire, Vakil continued, but your heart acts like water, your kind is unclean in its logic. Rain stepped closer, unblinking. And yet we're still here. Every time someone says we shouldn't be, we still are. Taran stepped forward, head bowed. I owe my life to her, and by our customs that makes me hers. The other ascendants murmured in shock. The right of Shalkit, the binding of a life debt, was sacred and irreversible among the Vatari. For a warrior to bind himself to a human was unprecedented. Vakil looked to the horizon, then back to Rain. Then let this war pause. Elsewhere at the edge of Krith territory, strategist Mechadon released a private communique to the Assembly of Codes. Human unpredictability threatens deterministic projection algorithms. Their moral logic vector resists categorization. Recommended action. Engagement, not elimination. Study, understand, before others weaponize what we fail to grasp. The Assembly delayed its response longer than any message in Krith history. Months passed. The truce at Brackel's Rim held, reinforced not by treaties but by shared memory. Human units escorted Covenant envoys through reclaimed terrain. Joint operations began: rescue, mine clearance, even rebuilding transport hubs. The Syndic, furious at being outmaneuvered, launched a strike on one of the shared posts. Both humans and Vatari died in the initial attack, but then, something the galaxy had never witnessed. The Vatari counterattacked with the humans. Not in sequence, not in parallel. Together, they flanked, they shielded, they coordinated fire without language. And when the Syndic reinforcements arrived, they were met by something entirely new. A hybrid battalion. Rain's brigade and Taran's surviving squad fought under a single banner, hastily sewn and battle-dirtied. Human grit, Vatari fury, no translation needed. The Syndic broke and fled. The Accord noticed. In the Vault of Prophets on Ragzir, a second change was made. The scrolls had been amended once, but now a full stanza was rewritten. In weakness they endure, in defiance they ignite, in mercy they ascend. The third prophet shed her oath skin, a symbol of revelation. No human knew of this yet. But soon they would. The hybrid battalion became legend before it became doctrine. In the space between battle and myth, humans and Vatari forged something unthinkable, a shared command structure. No culture had ever mingled with the Covenant at such a level, not in treaties, not in faith, and certainly not in arms. But now, at the dawn of a new campaign, they marched side by side. The battalion was dubbed Unity's Edge by its human contingent and Jarveshter, the wound-forged blade, by the Vatari. Command alternated between Captain Rain and Taranjar. The symbol they adopted was no flag, but a simple image pulled from the footage that had started it all, a silhouette of a human carrying a broken alien beneath a shattered sky. Other powers did not see it as unity, they saw it as infection. In the deep archives of the Syndic data sanctum, Blacktier analysts filed a report entitled Human Contamination Models. It projected ideological corruption rates among species exposed to extended human proximity. The model's prediction curve destabilized rapidly once emotional contamination exceeded 22%. For the Syndic, a culture built on isolationist stability, this was unacceptable. They deployed the Karen Protocol. It was not a military strike, it was a cleansing, viral code weapons, atmosphere destabilizers, directed tectonic resonance. Brackel's rim would be turned into a sinkhole, its surface cracked, its skies stripped of breathable elements, all under the pretense of a rogue asteroid impact. Rain received the warning 31 minutes before impact. A Vatari signal operator intercepted a pulse broadcast from an anomalous relay station. Within seconds, human cryptographers broke the code, a trait the humans had developed with frightening speed. The message was clear. Initiate cleansing, timeframe 32 standard minutes, no deviation. She had less than half an hour to evacuate 1,200 personnel, 89 mobile units, 5 relay cores, and most critically, 6,000 civilians from the newly formed resettlement zone known as Hekar's Gate. She didn't try. She prepared to fight instead. Across the basin, Taranjar addressed the combined battalion. His voice was ragged, the scars on his face etched now with a stylized human sigil, an old Earth symbol, the open hand. The Syndic has chosen annihilation, not war, not even domination, but erasure. He gestured behind him, where children played in the dust between landing pads. They fear this because it is not order, it is not code, it is something wild. Rain stepped beside him, she activated a projection. A countdown ticked at the top, 26 minutes. Anyone who stays past 20 minutes has no promise of extraction, she said calmly. There will be no evacuation, there will only be resistance. If you want to leave, I will not stop you. No judgment. This is not a war of nations now, it's a war for memory. Not one soldier moved. They began digging. Orbital strikes were precise in theory but crude in practice. The Syndic's tectonic destabilizers relied on harmonic vibration fields to shatter planetary crusts, but those fields required anchoring points, nodes deployed from orbit that resonated with one another. Captain Rain's engineers understood vibration. They had used seismic drilling on Europa. Within 10 minutes, they began deploying counter-resonators built from modified artillery coils and fusion cores. Vatari engineers, once proud and inflexible, now worked with human hackers to override the Syndic's frequency regulators. In one of the deeper craters, a human child handed a crystalline data slate to a Vatari technician. "Your codes look like music," she said. He smiled with all three mouths. "They are. They built their defense from song." At minute 22, the first Syndic probes descended, auto-targeting, self-replicating, disintegrators activated. The hybrid battalion launched into the sky. Jetpacks, grav-chutes, Vatari flyer beasts, every method of propulsion that could be mustered. Rain led the charge, her armor glowing red from overclocked exothrusters. Taran followed, wielding twin sunblades borrowed from the temple vaults. They hit the probe swarm before it could deploy anchors. It was not a battle, it was a storm. Explosions painted the atmosphere in violet and gold. Shrapnel rained down, dozens fell. Hundreds more fought with a rage that bent the odds. A Syndic supercarrier arrived overhead, preparing to deploy the primary destabilizer core. That's when the Violarian Reach descended. The Krith vessel, once a silent observer, had never taken sides in any known conflict. But Mechadon, watching the chaos, saw a moment that statistics could not predict. He gave an order never before uttered by a Krith. "Intervene." Mass cannons fired, neural displacers cracked space. The supercarrier reeled under fire from a race that had never fired first. Syndic formations scattered, unprepared for Krith precision. Down on the surface, as the clock hit minute 31, the last destabilizer probe was destroyed. Brackel's rim held. The galaxy paused. What had begun as a forgotten moon became a fulcrum of transformation, a place where enemies knelt to bandage each other, where ancient doctrines cracked under the heat of shared purpose. Humanity did not celebrate, they buried their dead in lines that curved toward the sunrise. Vatari burned incense. Krith sent encoded symbols of acknowledgement, one of which translated as equivalence, a concept never granted to another species. Captain Rain did not give speeches. Instead, she stood at the top of the northern ridge with Taran beside her, overlooking the sky where ash still hung like bruises in the air. "They'll come again," he said quietly. "They always do. They will not understand. They never do at first." She looked down at the survivors. A girl with red braids ran between two wounded Vatari, handing them water. "We didn't survive this by fighting harder," Rain said. "We survived by refusing to be like them." Taran closed his eyes. "In mercy we ascend." And far above, in the Temple of Ragzir, a new stanza carved itself into crystal. "And the sky bore witness to mercy's weight, heavier than war." The accord could no longer ignore Brackel's rim. When the Galactic Council convened over the central world of Nezarkar, delegates arrived bearing grievances and suspicions. The Syndic demanded sanctions against humanity for the perversion of war. The Harmonium petitioned for full protocol review of Krith intervention. The Krith submitted no defense, only a stream of encoded data containing footage, audio, and sensor archives of the conflict. None of it was doctored, none of it needed embellishment. At the center of it all stood a human act no algorithm could explain, the lifting of a dying enemy and the refusal to let him fall. And now that act had sparked a movement. The humans called it the Skywalker's Accord. It was not yet official, nor ratified, nor recognized in any treaty, but it was real. Units across border zones, Vatari, human, and even isolated Krith were initiating contact, forming shared patrols, joint relief stations, interspecies field hospitals. Where once warlords fought over salvage, now symphonies of cooperation began to echo in the vacuum. Not everyone welcomed the change. Within the shadow districts of the Outer Reach, the Lassen Blight, an intelligence cartel older than most suns, placed contracts on human officers operating outside Sol. The blood prices were highest for Captain Rain, Taranjar, and Mechadon of the Krith. Attempts followed: sabotage, assassination, infiltration by mimic species with synthetic skins. Some of them even got close. None returned. One, captured after detonating a pulse mine near the hybrid comms tower, had his mind read by a Vatari neural seeker. He believed in no cause, he knew no loyalty. He spoke only one phrase when asked why he tried to destroy the fragile alliance. "They're breaking the shape of the galaxy." And he was right. On Earth, for the first time in 2 generations, the planetary governors requested input from the veterans of the Brackhull campaign. Their testimonies shocked the public, not because of the horrors of war, those were known, but because of how alien comrades were spoken of. "They fight different," said Sergeant Yamal Dean, "but not wrong, just different. The Vatari use death songs, not for mourning, for remembering. I watched a Krith drag a burning APC 50 meters to save a wounded corporal. They don't feel pain the way we do, but they understand sacrifice." Old Earth myths began to blend with new names. Children in Africa and the Martian colonies sang songs with half-Vatari words. Artists painted the no man's sky in defiance of its name, showing it filled with hands reaching across the battlefield. War museums added new wings titled the Carriers. In the depths of the harmonium's data vaults, Ately's the High Voice made a forbidden decision. He initiated first contact with a faction known as the Urine Continuum, a nomadic archive species that wandered outside the boundaries of the Accord, chronicling moral shifts across civilizations. The Urine were not trusted. They judged without permission, recorded without allegiance. They responded with a phrase Ately's had not expected. "You are late." And then they delivered a file, simple, unencrypted. It showed the final moments of the Syndic operative who detonated the pulse mine. But in his neural residue, buried deep, was not hatred of humans. It was fear. Of change. The Urine spoke again. "They fear not what humans do, they fear that others will learn how." Meanwhile, in the outer systems beyond Brackhull's rim, human exploration vessels began receiving coded pulses from unaffiliated colonies. At first it seemed like salvage beacons, then like distress calls. But when decoded, each carried a different phrase. They carried one of ours. "Mercy in the ash. The ones who do not leave the dying." Within 3 cycles, 7 isolated species had contacted Earth directly, not through the Accord, not through embassies, through whispers, through gestures of trust. An insected hive cluster on New Abraxas offered humanity access to their ancient biological libraries, something no external species had ever received. In return, they requested one thing: that human medics be stationed in their birthing chambers, not for science, for presence, for comfort. "They are born afraid," said the hive mother, "and your kind sings when they suffer. We want them to hear that." Earth agreed. The first human lullabies on Abraxas were broadcast across 3 systems. The prophets of Ragzir heard them. And they wept. Captain Rain did not return to Earth. She traveled deeper instead, far beyond mapped corridors. Aboard the distant Halo, a retrofitted hauler-turned-mobile embassy, she and Taran led a new kind of envoy, one without doctrine, one that brought aid, defense, and stories. They called them the Carriers. They touched worlds abandoned by Empire, saved ships drifting between suns, walked across quarantined war zones, always in pairs, one human, one non-human. They became myth. Some said they were ghosts. Others called them a disease that spreads peace. Aboard the distant Halo, a new distress call arrived. Encrypted, unfamiliar signature. Rain looked at the data, then at Taran. He studied it with all 3 eyes, then nodded once. "No flag, no faction, just pain. Then we go." They accelerated past the edge of Accord space, toward a world no one claimed. Behind them, dozens of other vessels followed. Krith, Vatari, human, some silent, some armed, all willing. Not to conquer, but to carry. And in the deepest chamber of the Temple of Ragzir, the first prophet awoke in the night. Her vision burned with fire and breath. She called the others. We misread the lines, she said. Which lines? All of them. Then without ceremony she took the book of weakness and cast it into the void. It began not with a battle but a silence. The world of Threndalek had no beacons, no atmospheric chatter, no orbital presence. It was dark even under twin suns, cloaked in magnetic veils that scattered sensors and bent light. To most, it was just another failed colony, lost to plague or madness, best left to decay. But the distress signal that reached the distant halo was clear. A heartbeat rhythm encoded into pulse lengths older than human radio, older than Vatari harmonics, older even than Krith quantum cipher. Help us, we cannot kill what we have become. Captain Rain stood before her makeshift bridge. No throne, no command dais, just a reinforced viewport and a circular table strewn with deployment plans, old photographs, and a child's crayon drawing of the Brackhull sky. Across from her, Taranjar watched the telemetry streams curve into chaos as they approached the system. Something in the gravity well resisted them, not mechanically but intentionally. The signal pulsed harder. They were being pulled in, not pushed away. Mechadon arrived aboard the Krith vessel Nosie's Blade, now a permanent companion of the carrier fleet. His presence was more than strategic. He was Krith, yes, but also something more now. He had broken caste, spoken without permission, intervened, and lived. Now he stood at Rain's side, a symbol of what the old empires feared most, alignment without control. This place, he said, scanning multidimensional telemetry, has no pattern. Then it's perfect for us, Rain replied. They descended. The surface of Threndalek was not dead. It was waiting. Towering fungal structures curled inwards like closed hands, rivers pulsed with bioluminescent currents, and the air was heavy with memories, not metaphorical ones, literal imprints stored in molecular clouds that whispered when you breathed. Their landing zone flickered with images of the past. A young humanoid child running, an old being weeping over a broken transmitter, flames rising, then nothing. The carrier team moved forward 24 strong, human medics, Vatari soul keepers, Krith analysts, and for the first time a Uran archivist come not to observe but to stand beside them. They found the first survivors beneath the Rootspire Cathedral. Once human, once something else, now blurred. They were the Eclipsed. They had merged with something left behind, an intelligence or infection, a consciousness that did not understand time as sequence or identity as division. It had wanted to save them, and in doing so, it had erased their ability to die. Rain knelt beside the first of them, a woman with glass for skin and thoughts projected as fractured music. We never meant to become gods, the woman said. We just couldn't bear the silence. The Eclipsed begged not for salvation but remembrance, not to be fixed but to be carried. The carrier team did not leave. They established orbiting relays, filtering the Eclipsed's thoughts into coherent signals. They sent messages back to the Accord, not of threat but of warning and beauty. They took nothing, they stayed, and they listened. As days turned, a new phenomenon began. The Eclipsed learned to stabilize when spoken to, when held, when their stories were read aloud. The very act of being witnessed gave them shape. It was not science, it was not sorcery. It was mercy again. And it was working. In the central chamber of the Galactic Accord, the Syndic envoy demanded emergency dissolution of the carrier initiative. They blur the line between species, the envoy shouted, between war and peace, between truth and narrative. Aetles of the Harmonium answered softly, is that not the point? The Krith delegate transmitted a single glyph, transformation accepted. And then from the outermost ring, a voice none had heard in living memory. A Ragziri prophet. I speak not from prophecy, she said. I speak as one who has been changed by the humans, by the ones who carried. She stepped forward, robes trailing quantum sand. We taught that weakness was yielding, that to surrender to empathy was to fracture, but we were wrong, they did not fracture. She turned to face the delegation. They fused. Silence, then transmission lights blinked across the chamber, dozens of species voting not in consensus but in shared intuition. The council did not break its rules. It rewrote them. A new charter, a new symbol. Not a sword, not a shield. A silhouette of two figures, one carrying the other beneath a streaked and broken sky. The Skywalker Accord became real. Years passed. The carrier fleets expanded not as conquerors but as catalysts. They arrived in disaster zones, disputed space, rogue colonies, and every time the story preceded them. Not by code, by mouth, by memory. They became a myth of function, a story you could touch. Children on distant planets reenacted the moment of the carry, not as play, but as initiation. Pilots painted their hulls with human handprints and Vatari spirals. The Krith, once devoid of ritual, began to hold reflection hours where silence was filled with shared memory. No one commanded this. It simply happened. Because someone once chose to carry an enemy. Because someone once refused to let death define the end of a life. Because mercy is heavier than war. Captain Rain, older now, scarred, sat in the hollowed-out hull of the original distant Halo, preserved on Brackle's rim as a living museum. Beside her, Taranjar, his armor now ceremonial, cleaned the old fusion burns off a discarded medkit. "We didn't win," he said quietly. "No," she agreed. "We changed the game." She nodded. "People think we made peace." "They're wrong," she replied. "We made a choice and others followed." Rain looked up at the sky. It was blue now. The no-man's sky was gone. Now it belonged to everyone. And the stars waited.